Detection of vibration. Almost all tactile receptors detect vibration, but the different receptors detect different frequencies of vibration. For example, Pacinian corpuscles, they detect signal vibrations from 30 to 80 cycles per second because they are extremely rapidly responsive and they respond to minute and rapid deformities of the tissues. Also, they transmit their signals through A-beta type of nerve fibers. On the other hand, low frequency vibrations from 2 to 80 cycles per second stimulate other tactile receptors like Meissner's corpuscles, which adapt less rapidly than do Pacinian corpuscles. So, higher frequency vibrations stimulate Pacinian corpuscles and low frequency vibrations stimulate other tactile receptors like Meissner's corpuscles. Detection of tickle and itch. Now, these sensations, which are crude or less important, are transmitted by very small type of C unmyelinated fibers. Itch can be relieved by scratching if the action removes the irritant or if the scratch is strong enough to elicit pain. So, pain signals are believed to suppress the itch signals in the code by lateral inhibition. So, if we feel pain, we no longer feel itching, right? So, that is by lateral inhibition of the pain signals by, or the itch signals by the pain signals. Or in other words, a pain signal suppress the itch signals by lateral inhibition. Coming on to the different sensory pathways for transmitting somatic signals into the central nervous system. Almost all the sensory information from the different parts of the body enters the spinal cord through the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. But from the point of entry to the spinal cord and then to the brain, the sensory signals are carried out through one of the two alternative sensory pathways. These are the dorsal column medial lemniscal system or pathway and the anterolateral pathway or system. These two systems come back together partially at the level of the thalamus. So these are some of the signals that are transmitted through dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. So the touch sensations requiring a high degree of localization of the stimulus, the touch sensations requiring transmission of fine gradations of intensity, phasic sensations such as vibratory sensations, sensations that signal the movement against the skin, the position sensations from the joints, pressure sensations relate to fine degree of judgment of pressure intensity. So these are some of the examples of the somatic signals that are transmitted by the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Now coming on to anterolateral pathway. Pain, then the thermal sensations including both warmth and cold sensations, crude touch and pressure sensations capable only of crude localizing ability on the surface of the body, tickle and itch sensations, and sexual sensations. Now these are some of the signals that are transmitted by anterolateral system or anterolateral pathway. Now let's discuss about the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. Upon entering the spinal cord through the dorsal roots of the spinal nerve, the large myelinated fibers from the specialized mechanoreceptors divide into two, a medial branch and a lateral branch. The medial branch turns medially first and then upward in the dorsal column and proceeds all the way to the brain. The lateral branch, on the other hand, enters the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Then it divides many times to provide terminals that form synapses with the local neurons in the intermediate and anterior portions of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So this is what happens when the spinal nerves enter to the spinal cord. Pardon me, this is what happens when the myelinated fibers enter the spinal cord through the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. In this diagram you can see the nerve fibers or the myelinated nerve fibers from the special kind of receptors, Meissner's corpuscle, Merkel's receptor, Pacinian corpuscle, Raffane's corpuscle, etc. They join or they enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And upon entering the spinal cord, it forms lateral branch and a medial branch. The medial branch moves upward towards the brain, and the lateral branch, at each point it forms terminals to form synapses with the local neurons there. In a way, it moves towards the brain, and when it reaches the medulla, these cross over. Okay, because of this crossing over of the medial lemnisci in the medulla, the left side of the body is represented in the right side of the thalamus, and the right side of the body is represented in the left side of the thalamus. Now this is the pathway of dorsal column medial limb cell system. So this is actually the pathway of the first type of sensory pathway. Another important topic is somatosensory cortex. Human cerebral cortex is divided into 50 distinct areas called as Brodmann's areas. There is a large central fissure that extends horizontally across the brain, and the sensory signals from all modalities of sensation terminate in the cerebral cortex immediately posterior to the central fissure. Anterior half of the parietal lobe is concerned with the reception and interpretation of somatosensory signals, but the posterior half of the parietal lobe provides higher levels of interpretation. The visual signals terminate in the occipital lobe, and the auditory signals terminate in the temporal lobe. Conversely, the portion of the cerebral cortex anterior to the central fissure and posterior of the frontal lobe is called as the motor cortex. Here you can see the motor functions are carried out by this region, which is the posterior portion of the frontal lobe. And this is devoted almost entirely to the control of muscular contractions and body movements. And a major share of this kind of a motor control is in response to the somatosensory signals that is received from the sensory portions of the cortex, which keep the motor cortex informed at each instant about the positions and the motions of different parts of the body. So, two separate sensory areas are present in the anterior parietal lobe, and these are called as somatosensory area 1 and somatosensory area 2. And this reason for this kind of a division is that a distinct and separate spatial orientation of the different parts of the body is found in these two kind of areas. However, somatosensory area 1 is more important and more extensive. So whenever we use the term somatosensory cortex, we always it always means somatosensory area 1. So you can see in this diagram the different areas or different parts of the body that is under the control of somatosensory areas 1 and 2. So the different parts of the body that is under the control of somatosensory area 1 includes hips, legs, foot, trunk, genitals, pharynx, tongue, lower lip, eye, thumb, fingers as usual, or fingers in general, forearm, wrist, hand, elbow, etc. All these are under the control of somatosensory area 1, and somatosensory area 2 controls leg, arm, face, facial muscles, etc. There are 6 layers of neurons in the cerebral cortex, beginning with layer 1, which is present near to the surface of the brain, and it extends progressively deeper to the layer 6. The incoming sensory signal excites the neuronal layer 4, and this 4th layer spreads the signals towards the surface of the cortex and also towards the deeper layers. Layers 1 and 2 receive only diffuse non-specific input signals from the lower brain centers. The neurons in the layer 2 and 3 send axons to the related portions of the cerebral cortex through corpus callosum, and the neurons in layers 5 and 6 send axons to the deeper parts of the nervous system. These are the 6 layers of the somatosensory cortex, starting from the surface of the brain and progressively extending all the way to the interior. Starting from the surface, the molecular layer, external granule cell layer, external pyramidal cell layer, internal granule cell layer, internal pyramidal cell layer, and multiform layer. And this is shown with the help of different stains: Golgi stain, Nissl stain, and Wiegert stain. We already discussed that somatosensory area 1 is the most important one and the most extensive one. And whenever we use the term somatosensory cortex, we generally mean somatosensory area 1. Now, what are the functions of somatosensory area 1? Now, the widespread excision or the removal of somatosensory area 1 can cause the loss of the following types of sensory judgments. So, from these we can realize the functions of, or the real functions or the necessity of somatosensory area 1. So, the person that is, the widespread excision or removal can cause the following loss. So, the person will be unable to localize discretely the different sensations in the different parts of the body. And the person will not be able to judge the degree of pressure against the body. The person will not be able to judge the weight of objects. The person will not be able to judge the shape or form of the object, and that condition is called as asterionosis. The person will be unable to judge the texture of materials, because this type of judgment depends on highly critical sensations caused by the movement of the fingers over the surface to be judged. We already told that fingers are under the control of somatosensory area 1. So, if somatosensory area 1 is removed, that kind of judgments will be lost. So, these are the main functions of somatosensory areas: to understand the different sensations happening in different parts of the body, to understand the degree of pressure against the body, to judge the weight of objects, to judge the shape and form of objects, to judge the texture of materials, etc. The second pathway for sensory transmission is anterolateral pathway, and this transmits crude sensations or lesser important sensations that does not require a discrimination of fine gradations of intensity, like pain, heat, cold, crude tactile senses, tickle, itch, and sexual sensations. So this is the diagrammatic representation of anterolateral pathway. So we studied, or we just discussed, that anterolateral pathway is involved in the transmission of crude sensations like itching, tickling, heat, pain, etc. So nociception and thermoception comes under this kind of pathway. So it will be discussed in detail in the next few chapters. So we don't need that right now. So the characteristics of transmission in anterolateral pathway. We'll just mention these points right now, because in the next chapter, these all points, everything will be explained in detail. So what are the characteristics of transmission in anterolateral pathway? The velocity of transmission is only 1/3 to that of the dorsal column medial limb cell system. And the degree of spatial localization is poor. The gradations of intensities are far less accurate, and the ability to transmit rapidly changing or rapidly repetitive signals is poor. So this is the characteristic of transmission in anterolateral pathway.